Between this episode and the last one, we hit 10,000 downloads for Have the Nerve. Am I excited? Yeah, I am excited. You're listening to episode 30 of Have the Nerve, a podcast about disability. My name is Susan Wood, and I am your host for this episode and all the other episodes. This podcast is about educating, informing, entertaining, and advocating for people with disabilities. It's literally for everyone. So, as we go into this episode, let me ask you this question. For all the people out there who don't have a disability and don't need to use any continence products, don't know anything about it, how many times a year do you think the average person with a disability requiring products like these need to go to the bathroom? It's a lot. It's about 2,200 times. And how much does it cost? At a baseline, using a catheter is about the same amount as ordering a large oat milk cappuccino in Australia. In Sydney, I mean. And how do I know that? Because I think about that every time I order a large oat milk cappuccino in my Sydney suburb. It's a lot. So imagine being means tested for continence products that meet the basic need of you just being able to go to the toilet. And what does that mean for somebody who can't afford this? And how about what happens when you're an immigrant who needs to use continence products, but you don't qualify for any funding at all?
My name is Edwina. I am one of the continence clinical nurse consultants working with Coloplast, and I currently cover New South Wales ACT.
It's been a couple of years, but Edwina Spooner from Coloplast is back, and we talk about the very sobering realities for a lot of people who don't have access to a lot of funding or may not have access to funding at all, and the financial ripple effect that it creates. If you're new to the world of SCI and continence, or you're curious to learn, you can actually listen to Edwina on episodes 3 and 4, where she goes into more in depth about the big, wide world of SCI and the biggest thing that affects us all, continence management.
So I can chat a little bit about the schemes that you can access both in Australia and New South Wales. So obviously I'm New South Wales based, so that's tend to be where I focus. So you've got the NDIS, but unfortunately you have to be injured before age 64 to actually be able to access that. So if you have an injury, a week after your 65th birthday, you actually can't access that one at all. So your level of funding is significantly reduced. Lifetime care is something that happens when you either have work cover or you have a car accident. So they generally don't have a huge issue with being able to access continence products. They can usually get a pretty good budget. When you don't have either of those schemes or access to either of those schemes, there's a couple of things that you can access. There's something called CAPS, which is basically a federal-based funding scheme. You can access this if you're an Australian citizen, and it's a yearly cash payment of around $650. So $650 is not a huge amount if you look in the grand scheme of things of, someone spending between, $1 and $5 on a catheter, using 5 or 6 catheters a day. It's a really big shortfall in what that they need, but also covers things like, underpants and reusable pants and pads as well. So that's only a little tiny $650 budget for that one. The other thing you can access in New South Wales is something called enable funding. And this is actually income dependent. So how this works is that you pay a $100 fee to New South Wales, Enable New South Wales, and with that $100 fee you get $1,200 to $1,500 worth of product. So generally, if we're talking catheter-wise, and this is where I work with a lot of people, is trying to get the best catheters that they can actually afford in their budget and getting it through Enable. But I'll touch a little bit on that later because that's a really big beast to conquer that one. So the other one you can get is My Aged Care Level 3 and 4 can actually get catheters funded. Generally, you can't get your, really nice hydrophilic catheters that we all love funded, but you can generally get, adequate catheters that what you need. And then that's unfortunately about the maximum of schemes that we can actually get in New South Wales and Australia to actually buy continence products. So as you can see, there's a really, really big shortfall. If you are a traveller from overseas or you're staying here and not an Australian citizen, you actually can't access anything. So I have seen instances where people have come over to stay with their children for a couple of years, and whether it's to help with children or, caregivers, and they've actually then gone on to have an accident. And because they actually aren't an Australian citizen, they actually can't access anything. So that is incredibly sad and incredibly difficult that, on top of your household budget, which I can tell you everyone is stretched at the moment, you've then got to buy something that is basically to empty your bladder or look after your bowels. So really basic needs that we need to take care of that a lot of people actually can't afford.
I just did a quick calculation while you were talking. So if somebody gets the CAPS funding, $650, and then they catheterize 5 times a day, you're good to go for 26 days. It's not even a month.
No.
Can you get both?
So if you look at
both enable.
You can get both, yes, yeah. So you can get both. So you can get enable. Generally, I find pensioners get a little bit more of an allocation with enable, which is really good. But it is really based on income. So, I mean, looking at income things, though, I think they look at income. They don't always look at expenditure. So you may have a really, really good income, but if you've got a big house or you've got children at private school or you've got parents that you look after or other things that you actually pay for, it doesn't take any of those expenses into account either. And so even though you might have a really big income, you may not have a disposable income, so which is really what you'd use to buy your catheters. So looking at catheters, for someone that's using 5 or 6 catheters a day, to empty their bladder, that's 2,200 approximately catheters a year that they're using. So even if you're buying catheters for $1, which is, really about the cheapest catheter that you can buy, that is still a massive shortfall that you're actually not covering. So people actually have to then find in their budgets extra money to actually be able to do it. And, this is really unfortunate because this is where we see people doing things like reusing catheters because they have no choice financially to actually not reuse a catheter, because if you don't empty your bladder, what happens is that the urine goes backwards. And so you end up doing permanent kidney damage. So it's a huge health issue that people actually don't have access to good continence products or single-use catheters to actually empty their bladder. So, thinking about cost, long-term cost, it's much more expensive to have someone who has kidney failure than it is to give someone decent catheters so they avoid having kidney failure in the future. So that's a really big one. Yeah, I think people think very much about the short-term cost, not about the long-term cost. So looking at the short-term cost, yeah, it's more expensive to give someone a clean catheter to use every time that they use, empty their bladder. But it's actually much cheaper than maybe not having someone on dialysis or not having someone with kidney damage or not supporting someone long-term in hospital that actually can't live independently or, all those other things. So I think it's a little bit short-sighted in that regard, but I guess that's just how I feel.
No, completely. And it didn't even occur to me until we started recording people who are coming here from other countries who don't even have access to any schemes and just paying out of pocket. And then you were talking about, the cheapest possible catheter you can get is $1. And people are probably thinking, great, $1, that's awesome. But what sort of catheter is $1?
Yeah. So when you get a catheter for about $1, it's generally something that is obviously manufactured overseas, because you wouldn't be able to manufacture much in Australia for that price. But generally manufactured overseas, it's something that you have to add lubricant to. So thinking about, your catheters, because you're passing a catheter into urethra, it has to be lubricated to actually pass all the way into the bladder. When you've got a catheter that you've got to lubricate, what happens is often the lubricant doesn't always sit right on the catheter. You're at higher risk of actually touching it because, to get a good grip to pop it in. And actually they do their catheter, all the lubricant stays on the outside of the body. And when they're actually withdrawing that catheter, they're essentially withdrawing an unlubricated catheter because the lubricant's left on the outside of the body. So this is where if someone back to, doing catheters 2,200 times a year, this is, something that, so someone doing, 2,200 catheters a year, the chance of things like, withdrawal damage and urethral tearing and stuff is significantly increased. So if you've got, and there's thankfully a lot of evidence out there now, which is great. If you've got someone that can use a catheter that has already got a lubricant on it, it's lubricated on the way in and on the way out. It's easier to use. It's a lot quicker for people. People much prefer these catheters as well, because if you've got to go back to our bathrooms as well, if you've got to go back in and put everything down, trying to find and maintain cleanliness to actually open the catheter, put the lubricant in, then try and empty it because it doesn't have a bag attached to it, so you'd have to transfer onto the toilet. So all of those risk factors that actually come in, significantly increase that the difficulty of people doing it. So using a catheter that's lubricated not only has all those little benefits of reducing urine infections and reducing that irritation and whatever of the urethra, it makes it a lot quicker for people as well. So they're super convenient.
Could you just explain how people reuse their catheters? And, what do they do?
Current research is really pointing away from catheter reuse.
Oh, we're definitely not condoning that.
A bit like, 20 years ago, it was okay. My mum would, put me in the bassinet on the floor of the car. That was okay back then. It's not okay now, because we know it's the safest thing to do is to put your child in a car seat. So obviously, it does does change over time. So what we've actually found is really best practice is single-use catheters. So people that aren't doing single-use catheters, what they're basically doing is they're using the catheter, popping it in their body, pulling it out, and they're either cleaning it and soaking it in a solution to clean it. We also don't know, a lot of the catheters and intermittent catheters are actually designed to be single-use only, because there's not enough research to say that the solution that you're cleaning it in is actually damaging the fabric of the catheter or the surface of the catheter. So potentially you could be inserting plastics that are dangerous and that kind of stuff as well. So that's why all of the manufacturers, especially in Australia, everything is actually designed for single use. So reuse is really not recommended. Some people put them in glycerin, wash them with soap and water. But as I said, you know what? If you don't have a choice, some people actually don't have a choice. And so this is the only option that they have to actually empty their bladder. So, which is really sad that this is their only choice. This is their only option.
Therefore, creating more urinary tract infections and more kidney damage.
Yep. So increases the urine infections. So often what happens is when someone has a urine infection, they've got to go to their GP. That's a cost. Not a lot of GPs bulk bills these days. They've got to get a urine test done, which, gets sent off. That's a cost. Even if it's bulk billed, that's a cost. They often have to start antibiotics. So that brings down all the things like antibiotic resistance, the cost of them actually then, someone who's struggling to buy catheters then has to go and spend $20 on buying antibiotics to make themselves healthy enough. They then often either have to stay home from work or they can't look after children or grandchildren. It stops them going out. They feel really unwell. I guess in extreme cases when the urine infection gets bad, they end up in hospital. That's also a big cost to the hospital as well, because it costs the government to have people in hospital unwell with urine infections. So, it's frustrating that potentially this is something that's we could really reduce or really avoid actually people getting to this point just by spending a little bit more on better quality catheters or single-use catheters for people.
As somebody who has been under those schemes, I say this all the time, the NDIS is both the best and worst thing that ever happened to me, because I was under CAPS and Enable New South Wales, and I used to get repeated infections all the time because of the manner that I was catheterizing, to the point where I felt like I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And then when I was finally able to afford the catheters through the NDIS, what a game changer. But for people who are in situations where they are not part of the NDIS and they're on a scheme that's means tested, it's very, very difficult. And I feel like continence nurses just do as much as they can to try and help their clients because they know what a health risk it becomes.
Absolutely. I have to say, yeah, having a really good continence nurse is super important because, yeah, you work around all of these things. And as I said, there's lots of things that you can do, really creative ways of actually being able to access more products for people. So often one of the biggest things I do is I look at someone's budget and say, okay, well, where can we work? So, maybe through Enable, we get some of the hydrophilic catheters, the slippery catheters that they can use when they go out. And then, with their CAPS money, they can buy catheters that are a little bit less expensive that they use at home, that they can control the environment that they're in, that they can control their own environment that they're in. So they can wipe down surfaces, keep it really hygienic, as much as possible. It's their own toilet, so transferring over to their own toilet. So they're kind of their own germs that they're using at home. So there's lots of different creative ways that we can do it. One of the things I found, especially with Enable, is that to be able to get any kind of catheter that's not a basic catheter, you need to provide evidence. So thankfully, there's lots of really good evidence-based research out there that actually highlights how much better a hydrophilic catheter is compared to a normal uncoated catheter in regards to reducing UTIs, making it easier for people, having a better quality of life. So all of those things. So when you submit your Enable application and then put a little bit of evidence with it as well, you can generally get pretty good allocations. So as I said, it is based on your income as well. But I do have people that can get up to 1,200 of the mid-range catheters that you add water to and it lubricates the surface. Some people can get up to about 1,200 of those a year. Generally, your hydrophilics, your allocation, your standard allocation is about 270 catheters. So that's not even one catheter a day. So that's not even one hydrophilic a day. So there's a huge shortfall in this area. So the hydrophilic catheter, that's the fancy term that we use for a catheter that's already coated with a lubricant on the surface. So what it is that the lubricant is bonded to the surface of the catheter, and what that means is they don't have to add an external lubricant. They just open the packaging, obviously wipe around the area, pop the catheter in, and then remove the catheter and throw the catheter in the bin, so that the lubricant's actually already on the surface of the catheter. They're not having to touch it. It's slippery on the way in and on the way out, so you're reducing all of those potential contaminants and urine infections. So, and much more comfortable for people as well. It's easy to use a catheter that's ready to go than it is to have, a catheter that you've got to add everything to. It just adds a couple more steps in there, which makes it, a little bit more of a complicated process. So,
yeah, if somebody is traveling from overseas or immigrates from overseas, or maybe there's a family member who's listening right now who has a family member who has a disability and they don't have access to care and supports like these, what do you reckon their first port of call is?
That's a really hard one. I think their first port of call is the local hospital. So often seeing someone at the local hospital that they would have to actually pay out of pocket for, though. Often, people also have travel insurance, fingers crossed, or, some kind of insurance when they come over as well. But generally, your local hospital would be your first port of call. You could also try and access a nurse in the community. But unfortunately, a lot of the time you've got to actually purchase this stuff. So they've got to actually buy it, whether it's on, from any of the medical companies or any of the, really good medical distributors that we have in Australia. So they've got to actually purchase these things. One thing I found on this topic as well, but also getting an increase in the allocation of Enable catheters, is that actually go and see your local member of parliament. So if your local member of parliament is designed to support you in your local community. So if you've got an issue or you want to get an increase in your allocation, or you've got, as you said, you've got a relative from overseas that needs to buy these things, go and actually see your local member of parliament. What I recommend is emailing, because then you've actually got a paper trail. So don't just pick up the phone and ring. A, they're really busy, and B, often the secretary isn't always aware of what's going on. So definitely emailing and just explaining your situation, and maybe they can come up with a solution or put you in contact with someone that can actually help you, because that's really what your local member of parliaments are designed to do. Is they're designed to support you in your local area. So that would be one of my first ports of call.
It's so hard to navigate because you're working on the goodness of other people to come to the party for you to be able to go to the bathroom. And I say it again, I mean, I haven't said it in this episode, but if you were in a situation where you had to be limited by the amount of times you were going to the bathroom, would you want that? No.
Yet again, that comes onto the health costs as well, because we do have a lot of older people that I know that they, you know, I talk to them and they say, I'm only catheterizing 3 times a day because I just can't afford to do 4 and 5. And so along with that comes all the other health issues that come into it. If you're not emptying your bladder enough, you know, you've got issues with kidney damage, you know, and as you get older, on top of all the other issues you've got going on, as well as, you know, your body gets a little bit older. So if you've got people not catheterizing because of a financial cost, that's heartbreaking, you know. There's something going wrong somewhere if people can't catheterize enough.
So when people when people age, and we've talked about, you know, not being able to access the right equipment anyway from a young age, what are some of the continence... Oh, actually, you know what? Before I even ask you that question, what do people do when they don't even have access to the right funding for bowel care? Yeah.
So bowel care is another hard topic as well, because often people do have issues with bowel care. So the funding actually comes into the same thing. So Enable will cover either generally one or the other, or a mixture of both. So you wouldn't get huge funding for bowel care and huge funding for catheter care. So generally it's a bit of a one or the other. And then it's a matter of using your CAPS funding to cover that shortfall, which really doesn't cover it. So bowel care, a lot of people actually self-fund. So, yeah, it's just really difficult.
Yeah. And what sort of price range are people, what sort of cost do people spend for their bowel care if they need it?
It really depends. So if someone is using medications to actually get their bowels to work, you know, that really varies in cost from, you know, $5 to $50 a month. If you've got someone that's doing, you know, enemas, so you've got to buy your enemas, your lubricant, your gloves, all of that goes with it, you know, that can be $50 or $100 a month as well. If you've got someone that's doing, you know, something like a bowel irrigation as well, that comes at another increased cost as well. And they can cost around, you know, the $4,000 to $5,000 a year mark. So there's really significant costs here that I think people don't actually take into account as well. So bowels are really important.
And is this price range for people who are just doing it themselves or with assistance?
Both.
Because with assistance...
that wouldn't even take into account manned hours. Yeah. So if you've got to then pay staff to come and help you, that's another cost again. Generally, that comes out of if you're on your My Aged Care, you can get onto your level 3 and 4. I think the really hard thing is that I get a lot of patients that struggle before 65 to actually get onto the NDIS. So I have a patient at the moment, and she's got transverse myelitis, which is obviously an issue with the spine. And she has just been knocked back, because all she needs is catheters and a bit of physio. So they've basically said, oh, well, you can just do Enable. You know, you don't need to get onto the NDIS. But the cost of the catheters, and the only ones that she finds really comfortable to use, you know, cost nearly $10,000 a year. So how does she cover that shortfall? You know, she's working, her husband's working, they're paying a mortgage off, they've got children. How do you fit $10,000 into your budget? You know, it's really hard. And I know people will go without eating to actually buy the catheter that is easiest for them to use, which is really sad that people are actually having to choose between empty their bladder or eating, which unfortunately does happen.
I feel like we've just recorded 2 episodes of what are we willing to sacrifice to go to the bathroom or not, as the case may be.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, but it's really sad that you even, you know, people actually do think about these things every day. You know, and the cost of living is going up, petrol's going up, you know, rent's going up, you know, mortgages are going up. And so everything is going up. And so there's almost smaller amounts now for people to be able to buy their catheters. Yeah. So what we're going to see is an increase in people who actually can't afford their catheters.
Yeah, that's right. What are some of the things that we need to take into account as we're getting older with continence issues that's pretty much amplified by an inability to be able to access the right supplies?
Yeah. Well, I think as people get to retirement age, they have less disposable income. Often, when they do go on, if they do get onto a pension, they sometimes get a little bit of a bump up in their allocation that they get from Enable, but there's still a really, really big shortfall. So what we find is as people getting older, they're starting to reuse catheters. Glass catheters are making a bit of a comeback as well, which is not ideal. They are. I've seen a couple of those because people have no choice. They need to empty their bladder, but they need to be able to afford to do it. So,
but do you just want to give a bit of a refresher as to what a glass catheter is?
Absolutely.
And how is that making a comeback?
Yeah. So glass catheters are exactly how they sound. So it's, instead of being a hollow flexible tube, it's a hollow tube that's rigid and made of glass. So these were really commonly used for quite a while, but have kind of gone out of fashion because people have realised that single use is obviously a lot more beneficial than reusing a catheter. But when cost is starting to come into it, people are finding they're having to go back to doing this again. So glass you can sterilise quite well. Having said that, a lot of people that I see using glass catheters are really not cleaning them properly and not using them appropriately. So they're just at a much higher risk of developing things like a urine infection.
So what is the type of cleaning method that is needed for a glass catheter?
It really depends because those who don't advocate reuse. This is a really hard one to answer.
Yeah.
Some of the things that people have done in the past is washing with soap and water. Some people use boiling water. Some people use Milton or antibacterial solutions.
Milton, yeah.
So, no, take me back to when my kids were babies. That Milton smell. Yeah. And some people, wipe them down and then put them in glycerin. So everyone's a little bit varied, and as I said, we really promote single use, but that's not always achievable, unfortunately.
I think at a time when I was very limited to the catheters that I could have, and it was the 90s. It's very hard to. I went down the Milton trail as well, but one of the very early things they were trying to recommend my mum was literally just water in a dish that was sanitized in a microwave for 20 minutes and then like literally getting foil and then wrapping them up again because we couldn't access maybe the technology also wasn't there. I don't know, I was like 6 years old, but like it's just so hard to even find affordable catheters.
Absolutely.
And the schemes weren't a thing.
I always say to people, if you're in a situation where you have to do that, speak to your local continence nurse because I'm sure they've got lots of solutions. But if not, they can give you really good tips in reducing urine infections and trying to do it really cleanly and safely as well. So your local continence nurses will be one of your first ports of call. And they're generally a fantastic resource to have as well. Also in Australia, we've got the benefit of having the Continence Foundation of Australia. So that's basically a free national service. You can go on a website and there's lots of videos. You can also contact them and be put in contact with a local continence nurse that can give you a little bit of advice around it as well. So really important to look at everyone's individual situation and kind of go from there. I think a lot of people I end up accessing in the community have never, ever received any kind of funding. So I come across people in their 80s who've been catheterising for 20 years that have just bought the catheters themselves. And so when you kind of have a chat to them and say, you're actually eligible to get this funding and this funding, it's almost like Christmas because they now have this option of being able to use a catheter that they like and fit it into their budget. So it's quite a, I don't know, I think it's just such a basic need for people.
Yeah, it's a basic human right that is usually just not really thought about. But I was just thinking during this conversation, somebody's listening to this conversation and they've never really spoken to anybody or they don't really know anybody who uses these types of products. They've never been in a situation where they've had to even think about it. Why should they even care that this is a concern for people?
One day you might be in that situation, or one day your sister or your mother or your child might actually be in that situation where they require a catheter. But I also think as a community, it's really important that we're really inclusive and this is what people require. It's just another thing. So I think it's really important for everybody to actually be aware of it. And even though it doesn't affect you directly, does that mean that it's okay to completely ignore it? I think, really important that people are on board and aware of it. So, but I do often see, some of the social media posts that people put out, and people are like, oh, why would you do that? And why would you use the catheter? And I think, well, there's also obviously a huge education gap in there where people actually aren't aware that people have to use this stuff. And I think sometimes until people are in the situation where either they have to use a continence product or someone that they love has to use a continence product, that they're actually made aware of the fact that people actually have to use these products. So the more we talk about it and normalise it, the better.
I just had a conversation with a child psychologist a couple of days ago. We were talking about masking disability as much as you can, even though your disability is fairly obvious. And one of the first things that came up was catheterization in bathroom, because you're not having those conversations with your friends about how often you need to go to the toilet, so you just don't go to the toilet. And so I guess coming back around, when you're not really discussing these, and I will attest to the fact that in high school I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Now I don't really care. I need to go to the bathroom right now. But when people don't know and they're not open to those conversations, to the education element that you were saying earlier, we don't really know that these are deep concerns and deep concerns for people who are just not just children, adults into earlier into their older age, right up to the point of death. The bathroom is so important at every single stage of their life.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it can be really, really hard. I mean, I think as a kid, it's so hard to fit in anyway. And then having to have that other layer of, you have to use a catheter, which is why, it's really good that there's some really discreet ones available. And it's really important that, kids especially have access to really good catheters, because if you're using a really good catheter from a younger age, not only is it easier, and it's easier to have people that are going to be compliant with doing it enough, which is going to be better for your long-term health. So if you've got something that's easier and, more discreet for kids to use, they're more likely going to catheterize. So instead of going, hours and hours and hours without catheterizing because they're a bit embarrassed or they don't want to talk about it, giving them a product, if they're not quite ready to talk about it, giving them a product that's really discreet, that they can kind of use independently and pretty privately, will make a huge difference to their life. So, we should be funding these things.
Especially if the child it's already a traumatic experience having to do it yourself, and then doing it to yourself, and then it's not the equipment that you needed. Well, it's not the equipment that's the best for you. And then it comes along with a lot of different health concerns. And then if you're not using the equipment properly anyway, it also comes with further health concerns.
Absolutely. And also I think, cleanliness of kids as well. I mean, one of my favourite catheters for boys especially is one of our catheters that has a sleeve. And it's a really, really good one because, I know even just with my 9-year-old, as much as I ask her to wash her hands, I can tell you she never washes her hands. She's a grot. So she'll go to the toilet, and every time she comes, I'm like, do you wash your hands? Yes. Let me smell your hands. Okay. She goes back into the bathroom. So trying to get kids as well to do things like washing their hands is really hard. So especially I find the teenage boys having a catheter that's got a sleeve on it, it's not the end of the world if they don't wash their hands. They're not contaminating the catheter because they can touch the catheter. It's got the sleeve on it, so they actually don't contaminate it. So little things like that I think people don't realise until you're in that situation, that can make life so much easier for certainly a teenage boy to go and use the toilet.
Yeah, and is there an equivalent, no, not equivalent, but is there a better way for a female child who's also catheterizing?
Because the female urethra is only 4 centimetres, they've got the little discreet ones that you can get that look like a little lipstick. So I guess the idea is that, if you go out in your bag and everything drops everywhere, people aren't actually going to know what it is. It's not like, you drop a tampon out of your bag and everyone goes, oh my gosh, she's got a tampon. So it's kind of not the same thing. They're really, really discreet and they're designed to look like a lippy. So I think those are probably the equivalent for girls to use because they're really discreet. And there's also the catheters that you can get with the bags on them as well. So the drainage bags.
And how much are they?
That they can use.
And how much are they?
Yeah, they're $3 a catheter.
Yeah.
So
sorry, how much?
Any catheter on the market that has a drainage bag ranges between $9 and $12.
Wow.
So they're really awesome. If you're on the NDIS or Lifetime Care, great, you can have a bagged catheter when you go out. If you're on Caps and Enable, it's a pipe dream. So for you to go out and have a coffee and use, hopefully an accessible toilet when you go out using a bagged catheter, that's an extra $10 on your day. So I think people don't take these little things into account.
Do you ever find that there are people who, because of the lack of being able to afford continence products, they just don't go out? I'm just thinking about how, especially if they were to go out and socialise with their friends or something. I think we've discussed this in the past. Alcohol triggers off something in the bladder and you need to go, constantly, which you would probably not want to do if you could not even afford the catheters to be able to go to the bathroom in the first place.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think, it also comes down to, people have the right to be social as well. It's nice to go out and it's good for your mental health to go out and be with your friends and socialise and be part of the community. So that's really beneficial for you. So I think, I had a client once and he, just to go out, he used to have this big backpack. He'd have a big bottle of lubricant. He'd have a couple of catheters. He'd have a bottle to drain it into because he couldn't safely transfer to a toilet. And so he kind of had all of this bulky stuff he had to go out with. So often he said people look at you when you go into the bathroom because you have this big bag with you. Whereas what I did with him is that he managed to get onto the NDIS, and so we got him a catheter that was really tiny and discreet, and it was hydrophilic, so it was one of the slippery catheters. And that's all he had to take with him. He just had to take a packet of wipes and the catheter, and that was it. So
what a difference.
Him, it made it so much easier and so much less stressful for him to actually leave the house, which is what it's about. We want people to be in the community and we want people to socialise and go out. So,
and I think it comes back around to how much are you willing to spend on the people now to prevent them from spending down the line on additional hospital costs and that sort of thing.
I think there needs to be a huge emphasis on prevention. Prevention is better than cure. So if we can actually prevent people having lifelong health problems, just by spending a little bit more in the short term and giving them access to better products and better things to be able to, benefit their health, then why aren't we doing it? To me, it's a bit of a no-brainer.
Yeah. All right, Edwina, thank you very much. Do you have anything you want to add before we...
No, thank you so much for having me. I really love having these conversations because it's really important that we start to chat about these things, normalise these conversations, and really start to look at what we can do to help people get better access to better quality products.
Yeah, amen. You've been listening to Have the Nerve. This podcast has been written, produced and edited by me, Susan Wood. If you would like to know more about anything we've discussed in this episode, please check the show notes in this podcast. Thank you for listening.